The rain pelted against the window, a relentless rhythm that mirrored Emma's restless heart. She sat cross-legged on the edge of her bed, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. The storm outside had plunged the room into a dim gray, casting long flickering shadows as the trees outside danced in the wind. "Just 1 week," Elise's voice came through the line, her tone light and persuasive. "Come on, it'll be fun. We haven't done this since we were kids." Emma hesitated, chewing the inside of her cheek. It had been years since they'd played their swap game. As identical twins, their uncanny resemblance had always been a source of mischief. As children, they'd swapped classrooms, tricked their parents, and confused teachers. But this, swapping lives as adults, it felt dangerous. "I don't know, Elise," Emma said finally, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Your life is so complicated. I don't think I could pull it off." "That's the point," Elise laughed, though it carried a sharp edge. "You've been stuck in that tiny apartment, working the same dull job for years. Step into my shoes for a bit. Glitz, glamour, excitement. Live a little." Emma glanced around her modest room. The peeling wallpaper, the sagging bookshelf, the stack of unopened mail on her desk, it all felt suffocating. Elise's life, full of sparkling galas and designer clothes, sounded like stepping into another world. Maybe, just maybe, it was the kind of change she needed. "And what about you?" Emma countered, pulling her knees to her chest. "You're just going to sit in my shoebox apartment for a week." Elise's laugh softened, almost wistful. "That's the beauty of it. No expectations, no pressure. For once, I'll get to breathe." Emma felt the familiar tug of her sister's charm, the invisible string Elise always seemed to pull to get her way. "1 week," Emma said reluctantly, a chill creeping into her voice that had nothing to do with the storm. "And then we switch back. Deal." Elise's voice brightened, but there was an odd pause before she added, "Just remember, if anything seems strange, ignore it. People in my world love to make things up." "Strange," Emma echoed, frowning. "What do you mean?" But Elise had already hung up. 2 days later, Emma stood in Elise's sleek downtown apartment, her fingers tracing the polished marble countertop in the kitchen. The place was immaculate, every detail curated, like a page from a luxury magazine. Yet something about it felt cold, lived in, but lifeless. A low chime interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see a silver envelope sitting on the dining table. She didn't remember seeing it earlier. Picking it up, Emma noticed her sister's name scrawled in elegant handwriting, but there was no sender listed. Inside was a single sheet of heavy black paper, the ink glimmering faintly under the chandelier's light. "You've made your choice. The game is underway." Emma's chest tightened, her pulse quickening. Was this one of Elise's friends? A practical joke? It didn't feel like one. A faint unease prickled the back of her neck as she folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, deciding she'd ask Elise about it when they spoke later. That night, as Emma climbed into Elise's plush bed, the thought returned, nagging at her like a splinter. What exactly had Elise meant by strange? The first morning in Elise's life was intoxicating. Emma slipped into the routine with cautious enthusiasm, donning a tailored suit and stepping into her sister's world of high-powered meetings and sparkling social engagements. People greeted her warmly, though some watched her with sharp, curious eyes. A few moments stood out. Odd questions about decisions she didn't remember making, sidelong glances that lingered too long. By the end of the day, her nerves were frayed. On the surface, everything had gone smoothly, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, or that someone was watching her. Back in Elise's apartment, Emma kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of wine. She was scrolling through Elise's phone when a new message popped up. "Did you tell her yet? Or are you still keeping it a secret?" Emma stared at the screen, her breath catching. The message was from an unknown number, and no context followed. Her finger hovered over the keyboard to reply, but a faint knock at the door made her jump. Setting the phone down, Emma padded to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a delivery man holding a small package. When she opened the door, he handed it to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "For Elise," he said curtly. Emma took the box, her skin prickling as their hands briefly brushed. The package was light, but oddly cold. Back inside, she tore it open, revealing a single item, a black key, smooth and unmarked. No note, no explanation. Her phone buzzed again, startling her. It was Elise, calling as promised. "Elise," Emma said quickly, "I got this package. There's a key inside." "What? Don't touch it," Elise interrupted, her voice sharp and low. "Emma, listen to me. Don't open anything you don't recognize. Just keep it in a drawer or something." "Elise, what is going on?" Emma demanded, her unease blooming into fear. But her sister's voice softened, placating. "Nothing. I'll explain everything when we switch back. Just trust me, okay?" Before Emma could press further, the call disconnected. Alone in the quiet apartment, Emma sat with the package in her lap, staring at the black key. Something was deeply wrong, and she was beginning to realize she might not be ready to know what it was. The days blurred together, a seamless weave of polished appearances and whispered enigmas. Emma's initial unease in Elise's world had deepened into something more, an almost tangible wrongness that crept into every moment. Elise's glamorous life wasn't the carefree escape Emma had envisioned. Instead, it felt like navigating a labyrinth where every turn revealed another shadowy corridor. The notes kept coming. Each morning, a new silver envelope appeared on the dining table, despite Emma locking the apartment door at night. Inside were cryptic messages, their words heavier with implication than she cared to admit. "The mirror holds the truth. You're closer than you think. Do not trust the reflection." Emma didn't know what the words meant, but they gnawed at her. When she called Elise to ask, her sister dismissed them with forced levity. "Probably just someone playing games. You know how people in my world can be." But there was a strain in Elise's voice, a brittle edge that only heightened Emma's unease. On the fourth night, after another long day of impersonating her sister, Emma found herself unable to sleep. The apartment, usually sterile in its perfection, felt suffocating. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, denser, as if they were watching her. Even the silence carried weight, pressing against her ears. She got up, padding barefoot into the living room. The city lights outside barely illuminated the space, casting faint, flickering patterns on the walls. Her gaze fell on a tall, ornate mirror standing in the corner, a piece she'd hardly noticed until now. The mirror was out of place in Elise's otherwise modern apartment. Its heavy wooden frame was carved with intricate, almost grotesque patterns, twisting vines, small animals, and faces so worn with age they were barely discernible. The glass itself was oddly dim, reflecting the room in muted tones that seemed wrong. Emma approached it slowly, her heart pounding. Her reflection was there, but it felt delayed, as though it moved a fraction of a second behind her. She raised a hand, and her reflection mimicked her, but the tilt of its head, the faint curve of its lips, seemed off. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection blinked. Emma gasped, stumbling back. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream, her eyes locked on the mirror. Her reflection remained still, its gaze steady and unnervingly direct. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Emma resolved to investigate. If Elise wouldn't give her answers, she'd find them herself. She searched the apartment methodically, pulling open drawers and cupboards, rifling through documents. Most of it was what she'd expected: receipts, fashion magazines, old photos. But tucked at the back of Elise's closet, she found something strange. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn and cracked. The first few pages were filled with scrawled notes and fragmented sentences. The exchange must be balanced. Two halves of a whole cannot exist apart. Reflections lie, but they also reveal. Emma's hands trembled as she turned the pages. There were sketches, too, crude drawings of figures standing before mirrors, their reflections twisted and darkened. One page showed two identical figures, their hands pressed against the glass between them. Above it, Elise had written a single word: bound. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Elise. For a moment, Emma considered ignoring the call, but a gnawing need for answers compelled her to answer. "Elise," Emma began, her voice sharp, "what is this journal? What does bound mean?" There was a long pause. When Elise finally spoke, her voice was low and strained. "You shouldn't have found that." "Elise, tell me the truth," Emma demanded. "What's happening? What aren't you telling me?" Another pause, then a sigh. "I was going to explain everything when we switched back," Elise said. "But you need to understand, the game isn't just between us. There are other forces involved." Emma's blood ran cold. "What forces?" "I can't..." Elise's voice cracked. "Just keep away from the mirror. Whatever you do, don't trust it. It will try to confuse you." The line went dead. The air in the apartment felt heavier after the call, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. Emma avoided the mirror, but it seemed to loom larger in her mind, its presence a constant weight she couldn't shake. By the fifth night, the exhaustion of pretending to be Elise, combined with the oppressive dread of her surroundings, had worn Emma down. She hadn't heard from Elise again, and the lack of contact only deepened her paranoia. The cryptic messages continued, their words now etched into her thoughts. One must choose. The reflection seeks freedom. That night, the mirror called to her. She woke at 3:33 a.m., her body drenched in sweat, the room steeped in an unnatural stillness. Without thinking, she got out of bed and walked to the living room. The mirror was waiting. Emma stood before it, her reflection clearer than ever, its movements perfectly synchronized. But as she stared, the reflection began to change. Its expression grew sharper, its eyes more intent. The corners of its lips curled upward in a smile that Emma wasn't wearing. "Who are you?" Emma whispered. The reflection didn't respond, but its smile widened, its teeth faintly visible now. Emma's breath hitched as the figure in the mirror began to move, stepping closer to the glass as though it were trying to cross over. Emma stumbled back, the words from Elise's journal echoing in her mind. Reflections lie, but they also reveal. She looked around the room, panic gripping her. The shadows seemed to ripple and shift, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. Her reflection wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was behind her. The air was electric, charged with an invisible tension that made Emma's skin crawl. She stood frozen in the center of the living room, her breath shallow and uneven. The mirror loomed behind her, its surface shimmering faintly like disturbed water. The reflection she'd seen, no longer confined to the glass, was somewhere in the room. She could feel its presence, close and oppressive, as though the shadows themselves had taken shape. "Who are you?" Emma whispered again, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came a sound, soft and wrong, a faint, distorted echo of her own voice. "Who are you?" it mimicked, the words bending unnaturally as though spoken through water. Emma turned slowly, her movements hesitant. The room appeared empty, yet the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with a darkness that clung to her like smoke. Her eyes darted to the mirror, and there it was, her reflection. But it wasn't mimicking her anymore. It stood rigid, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. And then it smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of the lips that sent a shiver down Emma's spine. She took a step back. The reflection took a step forward, pressing its hands against the inside of the glass. The surface rippled under its touch, the distorted contours of its face seeming to reach toward her. "Elise!" Emma cried out, her voice breaking. "I need help. Please!" No response. The phone lay on the coffee table, dark and silent, as unreachable as the calm she so desperately needed. The reflection tilted its head further, as if studying her, its smile widening until it seemed ready to split its face in two. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice layered with 1,000 whispers. Emma's legs trembled, and she nearly stumbled as she backed into the far wall. "What do you want?" she managed, clutching at the plaster for support. The reflection raised one hand, pressing it against the rippling surface of the mirror. Its gaze bore into hers, a cold, invasive sensation that seemed to pierce through her very thoughts. "To return," it hissed. The realization hit Emma like a tidal wave, memories flooding her from Elise's journal. The cryptic notes, the warnings about balance, the sketches of twin figures separated by glass, all of it pointed to this moment. This wasn't just a game between her and Elise. There was something older, something bound to them, using their connection as a bridge. "I'm not letting you out," Emma said, summoning what little courage she had left. Her voice shook, but the resolve in her heart steadied her. "You're not me. You're not real." The reflection laughed then, a brittle, fractured sound. "And yet here I am," it whispered. "You've already opened the door." Emma's mind raced. The mirror was the key. It had to be. If she could sever the connection, maybe she could trap the reflection again. But how? The journal had mentioned balance, a choice, an exchange. Her twin's cryptic words echoed in her mind. Reflections lie, but they also reveal. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection watching her every move. The closer she got, the colder the room became, frost forming along the edges of the glass. Her fingers hovered inches from the surface. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling. The reflection's smile faded, replaced by an expression of something akin to hunger. "You won't," it said simply, its voice a low growl. "You are already mine. The moment you stepped into her life, the moment you looked into me." The exchange began. The frost on the mirror spread, the air around Emma growing dense and heavy. Her body felt like it was being pulled forward, as if unseen hands were trying to drag her into the glass. But she resisted, grounding herself with the only weapon she had, her will. "This is her life," Emma whispered, her voice gaining strength. "Not yours, and not mine." The reflection hesitated, its form flickering like a dying light. Emma felt a shift in the atmosphere, as though the room itself were holding its breath. She pressed her palm against the mirror. The surface was ice cold, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it felt as though she'd been pulled underwater. Her reflection's hand met hers from the other side, their fingers aligning perfectly. The glass rippled, and Emma felt a deep pull, a tether stretching taut between her and the figure in the mirror. Then, with a final surge of defiance, she closed her eyes and whispered, "This game is over." A rush of air filled the room, the tension snapping like a coiled spring. When Emma opened her eyes, the mirror's surface was still and opaque, her reflection gone. The air was warm again, the frost melting into faint streaks of water. Emma staggered back, her body trembling. The apartment was silent, the oppressive presence lifted. Her phone buzzed, and she grabbed it with shaking hands. Elise's name flashed on the screen. "I'm coming back," Elise said, her voice urgent. "Are you okay?" Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I think so," she whispered. "But Elise, this game, this connection, it's not just between us. We can't do this again." There was a long pause before Elise replied, her voice heavy with understanding. "I know. It's not just a game. It never was." As Emma hung up, she glanced back at the mirror. It was ordinary now, reflecting nothing but the quiet room behind her. Yet deep inside, she knew the boundary between their world and the other had been weakened. And somewhere, in the darkness beyond the glass, something was still watching.